look at these stone walls. To us, they represent the peak of medieval romancer, symbol of power, chivalry, and timeless elegance. We see them from a distance and dream of a life of nobility. But if you were to step inside those cold, damp corridors, the romantic illusion would shatter instantly, not because of war or enemies, but because of a reality the storybooks never dared to mention. Behind the grandeur lies a world of persistent stench, bone-chilling draughts, and a suffocating lack of privacy. Welcome to the hidden side of castle life, where the dream was often a beautiful nightmare. Let me ask you something before we start. When you picture a medieval castle, what do you see? Tall stone walls, glowing torches, maybe banners fluttering in the wind. A place of power, safety, prestige, somewhere above the filth of ordinary life. A place where kings slept peacefully while chaos stayed outside the walls. That image is so strong that it survived for centuries. Movies, books, even video games still sell castles as dreams made of stone. And honestly, from the outside, they really were beautiful. If you stood far away, especially at dawn, a medieval castle could feel almost magical. The way morning fog hugged the lower walls, the way sunlight touched the towers first, long before it reached the villages below. Castles were built to impress. Every angle was meant to say, someone important lives here. Someone protected, someone powerful, and if you were lucky enough to live inside one, people assumed you had escaped the worst parts of medieval life. That assumption couldn't be more wrong. Here's the shocking part most people don't realize. The closer you lived to the heart of a medieval castle, the worse your daily life often became. Not harder in a dramatic way, not violent or loud, worse in a quiet, grinding, inescapable way, the kind that slowly wears you down, the kind that doesn't show up in paintings. Castles weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for survival, control, and symbolism. Thick stone walls kept enemies out. Yes, but they also trapped cold, moisture, and smells inside. Windows were small, not because builders lacked skill, but because large windows were a weakness. Light was a luxury. Fresh air, even more so. Most rooms relied on narrow slits that barely let the wind through, meaning whatever smell entered a room often stayed there, and there were many smells. Here's a fact that tends to surprise people. Most medieval castles had no real plumbing at all. No drains like we imagine today. No sewer systems hidden beneath the floors. Waste didn't disappear. It accumulated. It traveled slowly through stone channels, moats, buckets, and gravity. Human waste, food scraps, animal remains, all of it had to go somewhere, and very often that somewhere was uncomfortably close to where people ate and slept. Even the most glamorous parts of castle life existed side by side with filth. Royal chambers were often only a few, walls away from garderobes, toilets that dropped waste straight down the castle walls, or into the moat. On warm days, the smell could rise, back up through the stone like a reminder. That beauty above did not mean cleanliness below. What's unsettling is how normalized this was. People didn't describe castle life as disgusting, not because it wasn't, but because they had no comparison. If you were born into it, this was simply how the world smelled. Cold stone, damp straw, smoke trapped in rafters, rotting food scraps in corners where animals couldn't reach. The human nose adapts quickly, even to things we would find unbearable today. And yet, adaptation didn't mean comfort. Imagine waking up before sunrise, wrapped in layers of wool that never fully dried. Your breath visible in the air, even indoors. The walls around you sweating with moisture. Somewhere nearby, servants were already emptying chamber pots, carefully timing their work so they wouldn't dump waste. Near windows that might be opened later. Silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, broken only by footsteps echoing endlessly through stone corridors. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Silence made castles feel smaller, not bigger. Sound carried too well. Whispers traveled. Footsteps followed you. Privacy barely existed, especially for those who weren't nobles. Servants slept in shared spaces, often near kitchens or storage rooms. Guards dozed where they stood. Even lords and ladies weren't truly alone. Someone was always nearby, listening, waiting, serving. So when we call castle life a beautiful nightmare, we're not exaggerating. It really was beautiful, but it was also relentless. There was no escape from the environment. You couldn't step outside to clear your head without passing guards, gates, and walls. You couldn't open a window wide enough to let the air cleanse the room. You lived inside the castle the same way the castle lived inside you. And the worst part, most people believed this was the best life available. That belief is what makes medieval castles so fascinating. They represent a time when luxury and suffering coexisted in the same room. When power didn't protect you from discomfort, only from invasion. When beauty was something you looked at, not something that made your life easier. In the next chapter, we'll move closer, past the outer walls, past the towers that made castles look noble and clean from a distance. We'll talk about what daily life actually felt like once the gates closed behind you. The routines, the smells that never fully left, and the quiet reasons why many people inside castles secretly envied those who lived outside them. What most people don't realize is that castles didn't just look permanent, they felt permanent. Once you were inside, everything about the space reminded you that leaving wasn't simple. The doors were heavy, the halls were long, the walls were thick enough to block sunlight for most of the day. Even time itself felt slower inside a castle, not because life was peaceful, but because every movement required effort. Here's a shocking fact historians rarely say out loud. Many people inside castles spent more time indoors than modern office workers, not because they wanted to, but because castles were built vertically and inward. Courtyards were small, outer grounds were often restricted, and during bad weather, which was frequent, people stayed inside. Stone rooms that never fully warmed up, even in summer. Stone is beautiful, but it's unforgiving. It absorbs cold at night and releases it slowly during the day. That meant rooms stayed chilly long after sunrise, and damp long after rain stopped falling. Wooden furniture absorbed moisture. Clothes never fully dried. Straw bedding had to be replaced often, but it rarely was. Over time, Everything smelled faintly sour, like old water and smoke mixed together. And smoke was everywhere. Fireplaces existed, yes, but chimneys were inefficient. Much of the smoke lingered, staining walls and ceilings black. Over years, layers of soot built up, trapping smells inside the stone. Archaeologists have found castle interiors where the walls were so saturated with smoke residue that even centuries later, traces remain. The air itself became part of the building's memory. Now imagine eating in that environment. Meals weren't small, romantic feasts like movies show. They were practical. Heavy bread, salted meat, thick stews, food chosen to last, not to please. And because refrigeration didn't exist, kitchens smelled constantly raw meat, boiling bones, fermenting ingredients. Those smells traveled. They seeped through corridors and stairwells. They clung to clothing. If you lived in a castle, you didn't walk to the kitchen. The kitchen followed you. Another uncomfortable truth: castles were noisy in ways people didn't expect. Not loud with music or laughter, but filled with constant low-level sound, creaking wood, dripping water, rats moving inside walls, guards shifting armor, footsteps echoing endlessly. Even at night, castles rarely went silent, and when they did, that silence often felt worse, like something was wrong. Privacy was almost non-existent. Rooms were shared, beds were shared. Even nobles often slept surrounded by attendants, servants, or guards. Curtains were used to create the illusion of separation, but sound passed through fabric easily. Conversations weren't private. Arguments weren't hidden. Your life was lived in fragments, overheard by others, whether you wanted it or not. Here's one of the most unsettling facts of all. Many castle residents preferred to leave whenever they could. Nobles traveled constantly, not just for politics, but to escape their own homes. Castles were symbols of power, not places of rest. If a lord could stay elsewhere in less impressive accommodations, they often did. Comfort mattered more than grandeur. So why did people stay? Because castles weren't just homes. They were cages made of obligation. If you were born into service, you didn't leave. If you were stationed as a guard, you stayed. If you were royalty, the castle wasn't yours, it belonged to your title. Leaving too often made you look weak. Staying meant enduring. This is where the nightmare part quietly settles in. Not dramatic, not violent, just constant, every day shaped by stone, smell, and silence. A life lived inside walls that protected your body while slowly exhausting your mind. And yet, from the outside, the castle still looked perfect. That contrast, the gap between appearance and reality, is why medieval castles are so fascinating. They were monuments to human ambition, built without any real understanding of human comfort. Beautiful enough to inspire, miserable enough to make people dream of leaving. In the next chapter, we'll talk about one specific problem that turned castles from uncomfortable into unbearable filth. Not the kind you see immediately, but the kind hidden in design choices, daily routines, and systems that quietly failed the people who depended on them. Let's talk about something people rarely imagine when they think about castles. Not battles, not kings, not banquets, but waste. Because if you want to understand what living in a medieval castle was really like, you have to follow where everything ended up. And in castles, almost nothing truly went away. Here's the first shocking fact. Medieval castles were never meant to be clean. They were meant to be defensible. Everything else, hygiene, comfort, sanitation, was secondary. If a design choice kept enemies out but trapped filth inside, it was still considered a success. Most castles relied on a system called garderobes. These were medieval toilets built into the outer walls of the castle. On paper, they sound clever. You sit, you go, and gravity does the rest. Waste drops down the side of the wall or straight into the moat. Below, simple, efficient, at least. That's the idea. In reality, garderobes were one of the biggest sources of misery inside castles. Because gravity doesn't make waste disappear. It just moves it somewhere else. And that somewhere else was often right below living spaces. Walkways or water sources. In castles surrounded by water, waste flowed directly into the moat. The same moat that animals drank from, that people washed near, and that sometimes supplied water during sieges. Yes, that means what you think it means. Here's a fact that makes modern viewers pause. Castle moats were often stagnant pools of human waste, animal remains, and garbage. They weren't the clean, reflective waters we see in illustrations. They were slow-moving, foul-smelling trenches that bred insects and disease. In warm weather, the smell could rise up and cling to the lower levels of the castle like an invisible fog. Even worse, not every garderobe emptied outside. Some emptied into vertical shafts inside the walls. These shafts had to be cleaned manually. Someone, usually servants or prisoners, responsible for scraping and emptying years of accumulated waste. There was no protective gear, no ventilation, just darkness, stone, and smell. And this wasn't rare. This was routine. Food waste added another layer. Castles consumed enormous amounts of food, especially during feasts or long stays. Bones, spoiled meat, stale bread, and scraps were thrown into pits, corners, or straight into the moat. Animals like dogs and pigs were often kept nearby to eat what they could. Rats filled in the rest. Here's another unsettling detail. Rats were not considered pests in the way we think of them today. They were simply part of the environment. You expected them, you lived with them. You heard them at night inside the walls, under floors, behind storage rooms. Their presence wasn't alarming, it was normal. Clean water was a constant struggle. Wells existed, but they were vulnerable to contamination. Rainwater was collected, but storage wasn't sanitary. During sieges, water quality dropped quickly. People drank what they had. Boiling helped, but fuel was expensive. Illness spread easily, and no one fully understood why. What's eerie is how calmly people accepted all of this. Complaints exist in historical records, but outrage doesn't. This was life. Filth wasn't shocking, it was expected. And because castles represented safety and power, people convinced themselves that enduring these conditions was worth it. The problem is, filth doesn't just affect the body. It affects the mind. Living in a space where smells never leave, where waste is always nearby, where water can't be trusted, wears you down. It creates a background discomfort that never fully fades. You stop noticing individual problems and start feeling generally exhausted. Medieval writers didn't have words like burnout or mental fatigue, but their descriptions hint at something similar. This is where the beautiful nightmare truly begins. The castle looked clean from a distance because all the mess was hidden, pushed downward, out of sight, but never truly gone. And the people inside lived on top of it literally and metaphorically. In the next part of this chapter, we'll talk about how smell became one of the most powerful forces inside castles, not just as an inconvenience, but as something that shaped daily behavior, movement, and even social hierarchy. If you could only experience one sense inside a medieval castle, it wouldn't be sight or sound, it would be smell. Smell was the quiet ruler of daily life, shaping where people walked, where they slept, and which rooms they avoided without ever writing a single rule about it. Here's a shocking fact that feels almost unreal today. People navigated castles by smell the way we navigate cities by traffic. Certain corridors were avoided at certain times of day. Certain stairwells were only used when the air was cooler. Doors were opened or closed not for privacy but to redirect odor. Smell dictated movement. The worst smells didn't come from obvious places. Kitchens, for example, were expected to smell. So were stables. Those were honest odors. The truly disturbing ones came from hidden spaces, latrine shafts inside walls, damp storage rooms where food spoiled slowly, and corners where waste collected unnoticed. These smells didn't announce themselves. They crept. Stone made everything worse. Once odor soaked into the walls, it lingered for years. Even after waste was removed, the smell stayed, faint but constant. Archaeological studies of castle interiors have found organic residue trapped deep in stone pores, confirming what medieval people already knew instinctively. A castle remembered everything, and because smell was tied to health, fear followed it. People didn't understand bacteria, but they understood that bad smells often came before sickness. The medieval belief in miasma, the idea that disease traveled through foul air, was wrong in science but right in experience. When the castle smelled worse than usual, people expected illness to follow, and often it did. Here's where social hierarchy shows up in a disturbing way. The higher your status, the further you lived from the worst smells. Noble chambers were placed higher in towers, where air moved more freely. Servants slept lower, closer to kitchens, waste shafts, and storage rooms. Guards stayed near gates and walls, where moisture and odor collected. The castle itself sorted people by how much filth they were expected to endure. Even royalty couldn't escape completely. Warm weather brought smells upward. Wind shifted, moats stagnated. During summer, some castles became nearly unbearable. Historical letters describe nobles abandoning their residences during heat waves, fleeing not from enemies, but from their own homes. Perfumes and herbs were used, but not for luxury. They were survival tools. Lavender, rosemary, mint, these were crushed, hung, burned, or worn to mask the air, not eliminate it, just soften it enough to function. What we think of as medieval romance Smells were actually defensive measures against constant odor. And then there was the night. At night, smells changed. Cooler air trapped them lower. Moisture increased. The absence of daily activity made everything feel heavier. People noticed what they could ignore during the day. The dampness, the rot, the faint, sour undercurrent that never fully left. Night turned the castle inward, forcing everyone to sit with the environment they couldn't escape. This is why the idea of castles as peaceful retreats is so misleading. They were never neutral spaces. They were active environments, constantly interacting with the people inside them. The building shaped behavior. It decided comfort. It rewarded status and punished labor. And yet, people endured it. For generations, in the next chapter, we'll move away from waste and smell and talk about something just as unsettling. Privacy, or more accurately, the lack of it. We'll explore what it meant to live in a place where walls listened. Doors echoed, and solitude was almost impossible. Let's clear something up right away. When we talk about privacy in medieval castles, we're not talking about secrets or hidden rooms. We're talking about something more basic. The ability to exist without being observed, and inside a castle, that ability almost didn't exist at all. Here's a shocking fact that feels uncomfortable once you really sit with it. Most people in a medieval castle were almost never alone. Not for sleep, not for work, not even for moments we now consider deeply personal. Solitude was a privilege so rare that many people never experienced it in their entire lives. Castles were built around shared space. Large halls, communal sleeping areas, long corridors that funneled people together. Even private chambers were rarely private by modern standards. Curtains replaced doors. Servants slept nearby. Guards stood watch just outside thin wooden partitions. Stone walls blocked light, not sound, and sound traveled. Every step echoed. Every cough announced itself. Every whispered conversation became public the moment someone walked past. The castle acted like a giant amplifier, turning ordinary human activity into something communal. You learned quickly that whatever you did, someone else would hear it. This constant awareness changed how people behaved. You spoke less. You held thoughts in. You learned to control your expressions. Emotional privacy became as rare as physical privacy. People performed their lives instead of living them, always aware of unseen eyes and listening ears. Here's something rarely mentioned. Even the act of sleeping wasn't private. Beds were shared not just by couples, but by family members, attendants, and sometimes strangers. Warmth mattered more than boundaries. And when everyone shared space, nothing stayed hidden for long. Dreams, fears, illness, grief, everything unfolded in public. The lack of privacy extended to power. Kings and nobles were never truly alone. Advisors, guards, servants, someone was always present. Even rulers were watched. Their lives were rituals, observed and recorded. Privacy wasn't just unavailable, was suspicious. Wanting to be alone could be interpreted as secrecy, weakness, or threat. And yet, people still needed moments of escape. So they found them where they could. In stairwells, in quiet corners of courtyards at dawn, in chapels when no one else was present. these weren't comfortable spaces. They were temporary refuges carved out of stone and silence. A few minutes of breathing room before being pulled back into the castle's rhythm. The most unsettling part, the castle trained people to accept this as normal. Children grew up without ever knowing what solitude felt like. Their sense of self formed under constant observation. Modern ideas of privacy simply didn't exist, because there was no physical space for them to develop. When we romanticize castle life, we imagine luxury and control, but in reality, castles controlled their inhabitants. They shaped behavior, suppressed individuality, and made personal space a rare luxury. You didn't retreat into your room to recharge. You endured. In the next part of this chapter, we'll talk about how this lack of privacy affected relationships, mental health, and even faith. Because when you can't escape other people, your inner world becomes both your refuge and your prison. When there is nowhere to be alone, something strange happens. People don't stop needing privacy. They just stop looking for it outside. Inside medieval castles, this meant that the mind slowly became the only place you could retreat. And even that wasn't always safe. Here's a quiet but shocking truth. Many people inside castles lived most of their emotional lives entirely in their heads. Thoughts went unspoken. Fears stayed unnamed. Grief was swallowed instead of shared. Not because people were emotionally cold, but because expressing too much invited attention, and attention was exhausting. Imagine never having a door you could truly close. Never being able to cry without someone hearing. Never being able to sit in silence without footsteps passing nearby. Over time, you would learn to flatten yourself, to smooth your emotions, to appear calm, even when you weren't medieval. Writers often praised composure and self-control, but in castles, these weren't virtues. They were survival skills. This constant restraint took a toll. While medieval people didn't talk about anxiety or depression the way we do today, historical records are full of symptoms we would now recognize immediately. Chronic exhaustion, sudden withdrawal, religious obsession, irritability, long periods of silence. These weren't personal failures. They were environmental responses. Faith became one of the few acceptable outlets for inner life. Prayer offered something castles couldn't: mental solitude. Even in crowded chapels, prayer allowed people to withdraw inwardly without raising suspicion. This is why religious practice was often intense inside castles. It wasn't just belief, was refuge. Here's a fact that reframes a lot of medieval behavior. Many people prayed not because they were devout, but because prayer was the only socially acceptable way to be alone. No one questioned someone kneeling in silence. No one interrupted private devotion. In a world without privacy, spirituality created invisible walls. This also shaped relationships. Emotional intimacy was rare, not because people didn't care, but because expressing vulnerability in public spaces was risky. Trust had to be earned carefully. Secrets were dangerous. Gossip spread easily in stone corridors. The castle itself worked against closeness. Over time, this environment produced a particular kind of person, one who endured rather than expressed, who observed more than they spoke, who learned to exist quietly. From the outside, this might look like strength. From the inside, it often felt like isolation. What makes this especially unsettling is how little choice people had. You couldn't change the architecture. You couldn't leave your station. You adapted or you broke. And many adapted so well that they never realized what they were missing. By the time night fell and the castle grew quieter, the absence of privacy didn't disappear, it deepened. Sounds became sharper, thoughts grew louder. Sleep wasn't rest. It was temporary escape, and when morning came, the cycle began again. In the next chapter, we'll talk about health, not dramatic plagues or famous diseases, but the slow, everyday physical decline caused by living in damp stone, poor air, and constant strain, the kind of damage that never made it into heroic stories, but shaped medieval lives all the same. Most people imagine medieval health problems as sudden and dramatic. Infections, battlefield wounds, but for those who lived inside castles, the real danger was quieter. It crept in day by day, carried by damp air, cold floors, and a body that never fully recovered. Here's a shocking fact to start with. Many people living in castles were constantly sick, just never sick enough to stop working, coughs that never went away, joint pain that started young, skin infections that healed slowly and returned often. This wasn't considered illness. It was considered normal. Castles were cold by design. Thick stone walls blocked heat as effectively as they blocked arrows. Fireplaces existed, but they warmed only parts of rooms, and fuel was limited. In winter, indoor temperatures often dropped close to outdoor levels. People slept in layers of wool, sometimes still shivering through the night. And cold, persistent cold, weakens the body over time. Dampness made everything worse. Moisture seeped through stone walls and floors, especially in lower levels. Bedding absorbed it. Clothing never fully dried. Shoes stayed wet. Fungal infections were common. Joint pain set in early. Rheumatism wasn't a medical diagnosis, was simply what happened when you lived in stone. Air quality was another invisible enemy. Smoke from fireplaces, torches, and candles filled enclosed spaces. Without proper ventilation, people inhaled soot daily. Over years, this damaged lungs. Medieval skeletons show signs of chronic respiratory problems. Even in people who never worked outdoors, the castle air itself slowly injured those who breathed it. Nutrition didn't help. Food was heavy and repetitive. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal. Vitamin deficiencies were common, though unnamed. Weak immune systems meant minor infections could linger for months. Healing was slow. Pain became background noise. Here's something rarely discussed. Sleep inside castles was often poor and fragmented. Cold woke people. Noise interrupted rest. Shared sleeping spaces offered little peace. Without proper sleep, bodies couldn't recover. Fatigue accumulated. Irritability increased. Judgment suffered, and yet people endured, because stopping wasn't an option. Work continued. Duties mattered more than discomfort. There was no concept of taking a sick day unless you were completely incapacitated, and even then, recovery happened in the same environment that caused the illness. What makes this unsettling is how invisible it all was. There were no dramatic collapses, just gradual decline. People aged faster. Pain arrived earlier. Life expectancy was shortened not by one disaster, but by thousands of small insults to the body. In the next part of this chapter, we'll talk about medical care inside castles, what people did when they were sick, what treatments were available, and why many remedies may have made things worse instead of better. When people inside medieval castles got sick, the question wasn't how do we cure this? It was how do we endure it? Medical knowledge existed, but it was limited, symbolic, and deeply influenced by belief rather than evidence. Here's a shocking fact. Many common medieval treatments weakened patients instead of helping them. Bloodletting was one of the most popular practices. The idea was simpleness came from imbalance, so removing blood would restore harmony. In reality, it often left already weakened people dizzy, exhausted, and more vulnerable to infection. Herbal remedies were everywhere, but consistency was rare. Some herbs genuinely helped, others did nothing. A few were dangerous. Dosage wasn't standardized. One healer's cure could be another's poison, and because symptoms were poorly understood, treatments focused more on ritual than results. Inside castles, medical care was also deeply tied to status. The higher your rank, the better your treatment, but not necessarily the better your outcome. Nobles received attention, rest, and rare ingredients. Servants and guards often worked through illness, relying on home remedies or prayer. Ironically, isolation and rest may have helped nobles more than medicine ever did. Hospitals, as we imagined them, didn't exist inside castles. Sick people stayed where they were. That meant illness spread easily. Shared air, shared bedding, shared utensils, no understanding of contagion, just habit and hope. Pain management was minimal. There were no reliable anesthetics. People learned to live with pain, the same way they lived with colby, accepting it as part of existence. Chronic suffering wasn't named or treated. It was endured quietly. Faith again filled the gaps medicine couldn't. Prayers, relics, blessings, these offered comfort if not cure. And comfort mattered. When treatment options were limited, belief became a form of emotional survival. Feeling cared for sometimes mattered more than actually getting better. What's unsettling is how often recovery depended not on treatment, but on resilience. Those who survived did so because their bodies could handle prolonged stress. Those who couldn't simply faded from records. Their suffering left no dramatic stories, only absence. The castle didn't protect health. It tested it. By the time people reached old age, which was rare, they were often worn down. Bones ached. Breathing was labored. Vision faded early. And yet, many still believed castle life was superior to life outside. Because, at least inside the walls, danger felt controlled. In the next chapter, we'll talk about fear. Not fear of attack, but the quieter fear that came from living in a place designed around siege. Suspicion and constant readiness. A fear that never fully slept. Castles were built to keep fear outside. That was the promise. Thick walls, high towers, heavy gates. From a distance, they looked like certainty made of stone. But once you lived inside one, you realized something unsettling. Fear didn't disappear, it moved inward. Here's a shocking fact. Most people inside castles lived in a constant state of low-level alertness, even during peacetime. Not panic, not terror, just a quiet readiness that never turned off. The castle itself demanded it. Everything about the design reinforced vigilance. Narrow staircases that forced you to watch who came up behind you. Doors that slammed loudly, announcing movement. Towers built not for comfort, but for watching. Even sleep was shaped by this logic. Guards rotated through the night. Torches burned low, but never went out completely. Darkness was never allowed to feel safe. And fear wasn't always about enemies. Inside castles, people feared rumor, suspicion, and misinterpretation just as much as invasion. Words traveled fast in stone corridors. A careless comment could be overheard. A moment alone could raise questions. Loyalty mattered. Appearance mattered. Being watched became a way of life. Here's something people don't usually consider. Castles trained their inhabitants to expect betrayal. The architecture assumed threats from within as much as from outside. Multiple locked doors, restricted access, layers of security. These weren't just defensive, they were psychological. They reminded everyone that trust was conditional. Even nobles weren't immune. History is full of rulers imprisoned or killed inside their own castles. Safe places became dangerous quickly when power shifted. That knowledge never fully left the collective mind. Living in a castle meant understanding that protection could turn into confinement overnight. This fear-shaped behavior, people avoided standing out. They followed routine. They learned when to speak and when to stay silent. Emotional restraint wasn't just cultural, it was protective. The less attention you drew, the safer you felt. At night, this fear sharpened. Sounds echoed more clearly. Shadows moved strangely in torchlight. Every unfamiliar noise demanded interpretation, rats, wind, a guard changing position. The castle never truly slept, and neither did the instincts of those inside it. What's haunting is how normalized this became. People didn't describe themselves as afraid. They described themselves as careful, alert, proper. Fear wasn't an emotion, it was an atmosphere, and over time, living in that atmosphere changed people. They became cautious thinkers, slow to trust, highly observant. The castle shaped minds the same way it shaped stone through pressure and repetition. In the next part of this chapter, we'll explore how this constant fear affected decisions, relationships, and even joy, because when fear never leaves, happiness becomes something you experience quietly, if at all. When fear becomes constant, it doesn't scream, it whispers, and over time, those whispers change how people experience joy. Inside medieval castles, happiness wasn't forbidden, but it was fragile, easily interrupted, carefully contained. Here's a shocking fact. Celebrations inside castles were often followed by long periods of emotional withdrawal. Feasts, weddings, religious holidays, they happened, yes, but they were controlled, watched, and bounded by ritual. Laughter rarely spilled beyond its assigned moment. When festivities ended, people returned quickly to restraint. Joy was allowed, but never trusted. This constant caution shaped relationships. People bonded slowly. Friendships were practical. Loyalty mattered more than affection. Emotional openness could be misread as weakness or ambition. Love existed, but it lived in narrow spaces, carved carefully between duty and surveillance. Even play was monitored. Games, music, and storytelling were permitted, but rarely spontaneous. Someone was always listening, someone always in charge. This drained joy of its lightness. Fun became another performance, another thing to do correctly. Over time, fear changed how people thought about the future. Long-term dreams were rare. Life was organized around survival, status, and obligation. You planned cautiously. You hoped quietly. Wanting too much felt dangerous. Ambition attracted attention, and attention invited risk. What's unsettling is how deeply this mindset sank in. Children raised in castles learned restraint before curiosity, observation before expression. They grew into adults who read rooms instinctively, who sensed danger in silence, who trusted routine more than excitement. The castle raised cautious minds, and yet people still found moments of joy. Small ones, a warm fire on a cold night, a shared joke whispered too quietly to be overheard, a song hummed under breath. These moments mattered precisely because they were rare. Joy didn't vanish to condensed. This is the paradox of castle life. Fear limited happiness, but it also made small pleasures feel intense. When you live under constant constraint, relief feels powerful. Comfort feels earned. Safety feels temporary. In the next chapter, we'll step back and look at the castle as a whole, not as a home. Not as a prison, but as a system. We'll ask why people continued to build them, live in them, and defend them. Despite everything we've talked about so far, by now it should be clear that medieval castles were never meant to be comfortable. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If living inside them was so draining, why did people keep building them? Why did they stay? The answer is simple and unsettling. Castles were not homes. They were systems. Here's a shocking fact to start this chapter. Castles worked best when the people inside them adapted to suffering. Every part of the structurates, walls, rooms, routines rewarded obedience and endurance, not comfort or happiness. If you could tolerate the cold, the filth, the lack of privacy, you survived. If you couldn't, the castle did not change for you. Castles organized human life the way machines organize parts. Everyone had a function. Guards watched. Servants cleaned. Clergy prayed. Nobles ruled. Movement was controlled. Space was assigned. Time was regulated by bells, routines, and duties. Personal needs came last, if they came at all. What's unsettling is how efficiently this system worked. Castles trained people to accept hierarchy as natural. You didn't question why some rooms were warm and others weren't. You didn't ask why some people ate better food. The architecture answered those questions silently. Height meant power. Proximity to the center meant importance. Distance meant labor. Even suffering was distributed according to rank. Servants carried the physical burden. Nobles carried the psychological one. Everyone paid a price, just in different forms. And because everyone suffered, suffering felt justified. Castles also erased individuality. Clothing was uniform within roles. Schedules were rigid. Behavior was expected. Over time, people stopped thinking of themselves as individuals and started thinking of themselves as positions, guard, cook, lady, lord identity fused with duty. Here's another quiet but disturbing fact. People often felt safer inside a system that harmed them than outside it. The castle offered predictability, rules, structure. The world beyond the walls was uncertain. Famine, bandits, war. Inside the castle, life was harsh but known, and humans tend to choose known pain over unknown risk. This is why castles endured for centuries, not because they were kind, but because they were stable. They created order in a chaotic world, and order, even when uncomfortable, feels reassuring. In the next part of this chapter, we'll talk about how castles shaped loyalty and obedience, and why people defended them fiercely, even when those walls were slowly wearing them down. Here's a shocking truth. Many people didn't defend castles because they loved them, but because they couldn't imagine life without them. Loyalty wasn't always emotional. It was structural. The castle shaped identity so completely that leaving it felt like losing yourself. Castles created a powerful illusion of belonging. If you served the walls protected you, at least in theory. Generations lived and died within the same stone boundaries. Family histories fused with architecture. To abandon the castle felt like abandoning your lineage, your purpose, your place in the world. This loyalty was reinforced daily. Rituals, oaths, uniforms, symbols all reminded people who they were serving. Even language reflected it. People spoke of the castle the way we speak of institutions today. Not a building, but an authority. An idea. Here's something rarely discussed. Castles blurred the line between safety and captivity. The same gates that kept enemies out kept inhabitants in. But over time, confinement began to feel like security. Freedom, by contrast, felt dangerous, unstructured, exposed. Psychologically, this created dependence. The castle provided food, work, shelter, and identity. Leaving meant facing the unknown without support. Staying meant enduring discomfort but keeping meaning. For most people, that choice wasn't really a choice at all. This is why loyalty held even during suffering, during sieges, during famine, during internal conflict. People defended the castle because the alternative was unthinkable. The walls didn't just protect bodies, they held lives together. And when castles fell, the damage wasn't only physical. Communities fractured, roles disappeared. People were forced to reinvent themselves in a world without the structure that had defined them. Many struggled, some never adapted. This is the final dark insight of castle life. Castles didn't just dominate landscapes, they dominated minds. They trained people to equate endurance with virtue, obedience with safety, and confinement with belonging. In the next chapter, we'll step into the final aftermath, what happened when castles faded, and what traces of castle life still live inside us today. At some point, castles stopped working. Not all at once, not dramatically. They didn't fall because people suddenly realized they were miserable. They fell because the world quietly moved on. Here's a shocking fact to open this chapter. Many castles were still standing strong when they were abandoned. Their walls hadn't failed. Their towers hadn't crumbled. What failed was the idea behind them. Gunpowder changed everything. Cannons didn't care how thick walls were. Height stopped meaning safety. A structure built for arrows and ladders was helpless against explosive force. And once castles could no longer guarantee protection, their entire purpose collapsed. Even fear operates the same way. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant, low level, ever present, a quiet pressure shaping decisions. Limiting joy, shrinking risks. The castle atmosphere lives on. This doesn't mean castles were evil or modern systems are traps. They were responses to chaos. They offered order, but the cost has always been the same. Human softness gets compressed inside rigid structures. The lesson of castle life isn't escape all systems. It's awareness, knowing when protection turns into confinement, when loyalty turns into dependency, when safety starts asking for too much. In the final chapter, we'll close this journey by stepping back and asking one last question. Was life inside a medieval castle truly worth it? After everything we've uncovered, the filth, the fear, the confinement, the loyalty, there's one final question that lingers. Uncomfortable and unavoidable, was life inside a medieval castle actually worth it? Here's a shocking way to frame it. For most people, the castle was never a choice. It wasn't something you opted into after. Weighing pros and cons, you were born into it, assigned to it, or trapped by circumstances that offered no alternative. Asking whether it was worth it already assumes a freedom that most castle inhabitants never had. From the outside, castles promised safety, protection from invaders, stability in a violent world, and sometimes they delivered. During raids, wars, and famine, thick walls could mean survival. For many, the castle didn't represent comfort. It represented the difference between life and death. But survival came at a cost. Inside those walls, life was smaller, controlled, repetitive, privacy was rare, cleanliness was minimal, fear was constant but quiet. Joy existed, but in fragments. You didn't live fully. You endured carefully, And yet, people adapted. Humans are extraordinary at normalizing the abnormal. What we would call unbearable, they called life. Discomfort became background noise. Filth became invisible. Fear became habit. Here's the unsettling truth. The castle worked because people learned not to expect more. Expectations adjusted downward. Desire softened. Hope became practical instead of aspirational. When you stop imagining alternatives, endurance feels like contentment. Some did find meaning inside castles, faith, duty, belonging, purpose, can thrive even in harsh conditions. But it was rarely personal. Meaning came from roles, not from self-expression, from service, not from freedom. So was it worth it? For the system, yes. For the structure, absolutely. Castles dominated landscapes and history for centuries. They shaped nations. They controlled populations. They succeeded at what they were built to do. For the people inside them, the answer is quieter, mixed, complicated. Survival often outweighed happiness. Stability outweighed comfort. And choice was a luxury few possessed. In the final part, we'll leave the castle behind, not with judgment, but with understanding, and we'll talk about what this history asks of us today. When we imagine medieval castles today, we see beauty, stone glowing in sunset light, towers rising against the sky, quiet, majestic, romantic, but that beauty exists because the noise is gone, the fear is gone, the people are gone. Castles feel peaceful now because they are empty. Here's the final shocking truth. A castle only looks calm when no one has to live inside it, when the fires are out, when the drains are dry, when no one is listening for footsteps in the dark. For the people who lived there, the castle was never a backdrop. It was a presence, heavy, demanding, always, asking something from them: obedience, endurance, silence. Life inside wasn't about becoming more. It was about holding together, and yet those lives mattered. They weren't lesser because they were constrained. They loved, they hoped, they laughed when they could. They found meaning in small spaces, in shared warmth, in moments of relief. Humanity survived even when freedom didn't. That's why this story isn't about judging the past. It's about recognizing a pattern. Castles remind us that humans have always traded comfort for safety, freedom for structure, softness for certainty, and we keep doing it. So maybe the real question isn't whether castle life was worth it. Maybe the question is this: what walls are we living inside now without noticing? The lesson of the medieval castle isn't tear everything down, it's awareness. Knowing when protection becomes confinement, when stability asks too much, when beauty hides a cost. Because once you see the castle for what it truly was, not a dream, not a nightmare, but a system you can choose differently. You can step outside when it's safe. You can build softer walls. You can leave the gate open. And maybe that's why we're still drawn to castles. Not because we want to live in them, but because we want to understand them. Thanks for walking through the walls with me.